Okay, so today we are, Today we are going to begin the section, reading through the section. Let me try it again. Today we are going to begin the last part of Old Testament history. We have finished the book of Daniel. We did that last time, which I guess is before Christmas. This is now January 4th, 2023. It's been a while, Christmas and New Year's and all that. So last time we finished the book of Daniel, which ended with them right before they went back to Jerusalem. Daniel was taken captive by Nebuchadnezzar in Nebuchadnezzar's first wave of attacks on Jerusalem in 606, 605 BC. He was probably a young man, probably a teenager, probably around 15 or so years old. And he remained in Babylon, evidently for the rest of his life. We know he was still there into the third year of Cyrus, which would have been about 536 BC. And it was around that time, or early in the reign of Cyrus, after Cyrus had taken over Babylon, that Cyrus issued the proclamation that the Jews, and not only the Jews, now the Old Testament focused on the Jews, but not just them, but all the captive people groups he had inherited from the Babylonians. He allowed them to go back and resettle in their old lands and rebuild their temples and worship their gods. The Old Testament kind of makes it seem as though he did this specifically for the Old Testament people, the Jews, but he actually did this for all the captive peoples he inherited. Anyway, so that is where we are. This is around the 538 or so BC when this issue went forth. I don't know how long it took them to get ready and get moving. Not too long. They were ready to go. Some of them were, at least. And so we've got about 100 years now left of Old Testament history. We're in about 538 BC, and the Old Testament will go down to about 440-ish BC. And that'll be it. And then we got 400 years of silence. Now, some of that 400 years of silence was previewed for us in the book of Daniel. Even though God was not, God was not planning on sending any prophets to Israel during that time. But he didn't leave Israel without a light during that time. So he gave them the blueprint for how those 400 years or so were going to go in the book of Daniel. And we do have material that was written during that time. It's just not inspired. It's not doctrinal. We should not, we have the Apocrypha, expansions of some of the late Old Testament books. Or in some cases, totally. In some cases, the Apocrypha is basically an expansion, Greek expansions of the existing Old Testament books. Like there's an expanded version of Ezra and Esther in there, for example. And in some cases, they're entirely new books, They are useful for providing historical information about that period of time, because when we turn the page, in my Bible, the copy I'm using right now, which I will eventually replace, the Old Testament, Malachi is the last book arranged in the Old Testament in this copy, and in Malachi ends right here on page 799. And you flip one page, and you get the new heading, the heading of the New Testament, and flip another page, and there's Matthew. Okay. Well, in the course of flipping those two pages, we skip 400 plus years of history, which the Old Testament doesn't cover. Now, we do have some material that does. I'm not going to read that. I'm not going to read the Apocrypha. I'm not going to do this other videos about the Apocrypha. But anyway, so right now, that's a little bit from now. Right now, we are in about the 530s BC, and we've got about 100 more years of Old Testament history. We've got the books of Ezra-Nehemiah, which originally were one book, and another instance were like Chronicles and Kings and Samuel. Oh gosh. Oh no. Oh no. Okay. Like Chronicles and Kings and Samuel, Ezra-Nehemiah was one book that was eventually split into two. And we got Esther, and we've got 3 more prophet books to go through, Haggai, Zechariah, and Malachi. But after we've gone through what we've gone through with those prophets, those are going to be easy. Now, Zechariah's got some colorful language in it, some figures of speech and imagery and stuff. But after we've gone through what we've already gone through with the prophets, we're ready for anything now. Anyway, I'm trying to figure out where to put this. But today, well, my goal today is to begin and start the first couple chapters of Ezra. But before I do that, it is now time at long last to read the first 9 chapters of 1 Chronicles. I have already read through the rest of 1 Chronicles and 2 Chronicles. I did that while I was reading the other historical books, Samuel and Kings. I went back and forth between the passages in Samuel and Kings, and then I skipped ahead to the Chronicles parallels of those same passages to see the differences. I like doing it that way. It helps it make sense to me that way. Chronicles was written well after Samuel and Kings were written, and it was written from a different perspective with a different goal. So it's helpful to kind of see, to get all the information by reading the straightforward historical accounts in Samuel and Kings, and then reading the different perspective recorded in Chronicles, because Chronicles was written quite a bit later. The Chronicles starts with this long genealogy that we just skipped when I read through Chronicles. Chronicles is the last book arranged in the Old Testament Hebrew canon. And it probably was, again, remember, Chronicles was originally one book. And Chronicles probably was the last Old Testament book to be written. In a way, Chronicles does, in a way, it's not chronologically the last, but it does deserve, in a sense, the position of being last, because it probably was written last. And it incorporates material from all the rest of the Old Testament and teaches lessons from all the rest of the Old Testament. There is value in reading Chronicles last. It is arranged last in the Hebrew canon. I did not do it that way. When we were going through this material, I was reading it as close as I could to a straightforward historical chronology so that we could understand the context of these events as they happened. And I believe that from our perspective today, we didn't live through these things. This is not our cultural history. I believe that from our perspective today, it is worth doing it the way I did it, because it helps us understand the events and the context and how that would affect people's perception of things. Yeah, because nothing happens in a vacuum. Okay, there's a cause and effect to everything. And so by understanding the history and understanding the way things developed over time, we understand these causes and effects, and we can understand why things happen the way they do or people act the way they do. So that's why I did it the way I did it. But there is value also in reading Chronicles last, because it probably was written last, and it incorporates material and lessons from the entire rest of the Old Testament. When Jesus and the apostles studied their Bibles in the 1st century AD, they read Chronicles last. But when I did read Chronicles, I completely skipped the first 9 chapters, because this is the genealogies. And there are a few things in the Bible that are less interesting to read in the genealogies. I am going to read this material, okay? I am going to read 1 Chronicles 1 through 9. This is not my strength, okay? It's like I'm not big on the genealogies. So I'm not going to pretend that I'm going to be able to explain everything that needs to be explained here. I'm going to cover some broad points, though. For one thing, these genealogies were written by the chronicler. There's an old tradition that the chronicler was Ezra, and that's possible. It's also possible, and to me, maybe a smidge more likely, that the chronicler. Oh no, what did she do? Oh no, this could be very bad. It's also possible, and maybe a smidge more likely to me, if the chronicler was someone who came right after Ezra, maybe a disciple or a trainee of Ezra. Ezra was a priest and a scribe. And we'll read about him when we get to Ezra. And he certainly wrote portions of this material, because some of this is written in the first person from his perspective. So he could have written Ezra and compiled Nehemiah and compiled the Chronicles. You know, most people think that the Chronicles and Ezra and Nehemiah were all written by the same person, whether it was Ezra or somebody else. My guess is that it was probably someone just after Ezra, because it seems like the timing would unless Ezra was a very young man when he went to Jerusalem, and he may have been, it seems like the timing would make it a little difficult for him to be the writer or the compiler. He wrote some of it, definitely. But whether or not he was the final editor or compiler, a little tricky, because it would seem to me like the timing would be a little bit beyond him. But anyway, we'll cover that more a little bit later. So anyway, whoever this person was, Ezra or someone just after him, this person was a post-exile Jew living in Jerusalem, writing from a perspective of post-exile Jews. And so the Chronicles, these genealogies, the primary purpose of them is to connect his generation, the people of his day in the late 400s BC, to the generations past before the temple fell. In particular, he's got two main focuses: establishing that the seed of David is still around and the promises to David are still in effect, and that involves the throne and the Messiah and the ruler, the king that is to come, and establishing that the priesthood is legitimate. The priesthood that is operating in his day needs to be established as being legitimately connected and descended from the priesthood that operated in the first temple before the destruction. This is coming at a time when the temple is back in full functionality again. It exists, it's built. I have cats everywhere, I just constantly got to keep track of these cats. And the priesthood is functioning, and so this chronicler is very interested in making sure that the lines of the priesthood and the king's genealogies are accurately traced, and to establish the connection between his community and the post-exile, the pre-exile communities. And so that's the main purpose of these chronicles. This is obviously these genealogies. This is obviously a very telescoped genealogy, meaning we're only focusing on certain names. There were thousands upon thousands of people who lived and died during these times whose names could have been included, but the chronicler only saw fit to include a few hundred names, or however many. I don't even know how many he's got, but as long as this list is, it could have been a lot longer. It could have been a lot longer. He's going to go all the way back to Adam and connect it to his own day, and the early, about 425 or so BC is when this would have been written. Okay, let me say a couple more things. These genealogies are still important to us today in some sense. I mean, the Holy Spirit ultimately did see fit to include this material in the Scriptures. There's a reason for that. Okay, we can trace the descendancy of Jesus all the way back to Adam this way. But it's also true that the human writer who put this down, the chronicler, Ezra, whoever it may have been, had intention. It meant more to him than it does to us today. He had a more vested interest in recording these family lines than matters to us today, because the Jewish genealogies don't mean anything to us today as far as their active role in our lives today. There is no priesthood. The Messiah has already come. The kingship has been established. The kingdom is here. Now, these genealogies are still useful to us to have that record of physical descent recorded, but we don't need to use these genealogies to prove the legitimacy of an existing Levitical priesthood, because that's over and done with. It's never going to be active again. We don't need to use these genealogies to prove family inheritances to tribal or family claims to their ancestral inheritances. Remember, when they came into the land, they all received an inheritance, and they were supposed to keep that inheritance. Now they're coming back to the land, they're trying to reclaim their inheritances. That doesn't matter to us today anymore either. Okay, all of that came to an end a long time ago. It's never going to be reestablished. In Ezra's day, or the chronicler's day, that hadn't come to an end yet. And he's trying to reform these links to the past to connect his generation with the past generations. But this is all in our past now. So this genealogy mattered more to the chronicler than it's going to matter to us today. He has goals and purposes and reasons for including this that no longer affect anything today. You have to keep that in mind. He also drew this material from a lot of different sources. Some of it came from the rest of the Old Testament. A lot of it did, in fact. These early parts about Adam, the early genealogies, that's going to come straight from Genesis. So a lot of this we're going to have already read. Some of it comes from Numbers and Exodus, during that account of the Jews, or the Hebrews at the time, leaving Egypt and going into the land. Some of it comes from Joshua when they got into the land. Some of it comes from Ruth, where we trace the descendancy of David's family down to Jesse, his father. Okay, so some of this comes from, I told you that Chronicles draws from all the rest of the Old Testament. And some of it is these genealogies that he's going to pull straight from other places in the Old Testament. Some of it he's drawing from sources that he had access to that we don't. There's going to be a couple of different times in here where he talks about referring to a military census that was done in the days of Jotham or Jeroboam, the kings of Judah and Israel, or Hezekiah. Some of these names and tribal genealogies he's going to apparently go draw from military censuses that were performed that he has still had access to that we don't have access to any longer. So some of these genealogies are military in nature, some of them are religious in nature, some of them are royal in nature. He's going to be drawing them from all over the place. Some of it we're going to have read before, some of it is going to be new. A lot of these names I'm not going to know how to pronounce. Most of them I'm not going to know how to pronounce, so just bear with me. And there's going to be a lot of son of, or begot, or father, begot, whatever the version of the NIV uses. There's going to be a lot of that. This genealogy is also not going to be completely straightforward. We're going to end up going from Adam down to the days of the chronicler. And sometimes they're going to do these branching genealogies where we cover one set of family down to a certain point, and we back up to an early generation, and then go down another line and continue from there. And it happens a lot. I'm not going to even try to keep. I'll try a little bit, but it's hard. I mean, these are a lot of weird names, and I'm not great on family trees and things like that anyway. So This is not. Cats are goddamn. This is not an area that I'm particularly strong in, period. So it's going to be difficult. And so we're going to have, like I said, another thing to keep in mind is that these genealogies are not complete. I mentioned earlier that there are thousands upon thousands upon thousands of names he could have included in this. And he only included a couple hundred. Alright? And even in these successive lines of father to son to son to son to son to son to son, he's going to skip some. We have other genealogical records in the Old Testament that include names that aren't mentioned here. So we know that these lists are not complete. Alright? We have to accept that. That's fine. In their minds, that's fine. Okay? Also, some of these genealogies are going to be based more on territory than on people. There are going to be some instances where we're going to have someone call it the father of Bethlehem. Well, Bethlehem's a town. Okay? And so, well, how do you father a town? Well, you found it. We would call it a founder. All right, that's how we would think of it today. But again, that's not how late 4th century BC Jewish scribe thought of it. Okay, you just gotta accept that. Like this guy's way of seeing the world and processing information and recording information in his mind and in his paper is just different than ours. Okay, it's like we're just going to have to accept that. And he's long gone, whoever he is, Ezra or somebody else. He's been dead for 2,600 years. He's not going to update himself to our standards today. We're going to have to approach his material the way he wrote it. Also keeping in mind that ultimately the Holy Spirit authored this material, and the Holy Spirit may have had purposes that were higher and different than what the human author had in mind. So, that is an intro to the genealogies and chronicles, as well as to the rest of the Old Testament, the last 100 years or so of Hebrew history that we have recorded for us, that cover the period of time from their return from exile down to the full rebuilding of the city of Jerusalem at the end of Nehemiah. And so now I'm going to go on and read 1 Chronicles 1 through 9.